Going to be the second of our three-part series on food, and the first one was beer, which we did about a month ago, and we're going to do cheese. And next month,
perhaps in March.
I don't think it's going to have the same pull as wine, but we'll never know. And wine is tonight, so we're going to hold off there. I know there's some people who actually know a lot about wine, and we're going to get some input on this afterwards. But first, we'd like to introduce Rabbi Milevsky. Programs. We have two morning programs coming up in early February. With Torah Seoing. It's for ladies only, but it'll be a Sunday morning. It's in the bulletin. We have the book review on February 7th, and we have a Gringo's Guide to. It's going to be a discussion. It's going to be a discussion about halachic disasters that we've had in our history and how we deal with them. Should promise to be very interesting, and that's going to take place not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. It'll be a breakfast with our normal sumptuous breakfast, and everyone is more. Please bring your friends, and there are another couple of programs which we've got on the schedule. I don't have the details. Okay, get going. I don't have the details. You'll see it in the bulletin. Without further ado, Rabbi Milevsky.
Good evening. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you, Pesach. The beverage of the gods. L'chaim.
Coffee?
No. Neither. In some ways, I could have named the class, I could have named our lecture A Cover-Up in Venice. I could have, but I didn't. It's the history, the halachic history of wine. As you could imagine, the history is broad. The topic is great. But a brief revisiting of the significance of this beverage. In some ways, you could label wine as the purpose of the world. You could label wine as the beverage that is the purpose of our creation. And what do I mean by that? So, according to one opinion in the Talmud, and the Kabbalists note that the fruit, the prohibited fruit, the Etz Hadat, was actually grapes. And the Kabbalists note, this is something that's shared by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto in the 18th century, that they had a tradition that what was supposed to occur in the Garden of Eden was that they would avoid the prohibited fruit until the Sabbath, until Shabbat. Come Shabbat, they were supposed to take the prohibited fruit, the grapes, crush them and make wine out of it, and use it for Kiddush. Adam and Eve fail, so therefore we have to live in the world that exists as we know it. It was the purpose of creation, to overcome the challenge, the temptation of the bottle of wine, and use it at the right time, in the right way. They failed. It is interesting to note that when our ancestors in the wilderness sent spies to the land of Israel, the Torah notes v'hayamim that those days were Yemei Bikurei Anavim, the days that the first grapes were ripe. They returned 40 days later. The nation of Israel panics, and we are handed, according to tradition, Tisha B'Av. From the moment of grapes maturing, if you crush them that day, how long will it take for you to have wine? 40 days. Rambam tells us that in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, You have to have wine for libations. You take grape juice that is not going to work. You have to have grape juice that has been aged at least 40 days. So if you do the math, they leave 40 days before Tisha B'Av. Those were the days that the first grapes matured. So obviously they were traveling, they entered into the land of Israel the days when you crush the grapes. When they returned 40 days later, the day of panic, the day of Tisha B'Av, was the day that wine happened to be ready. It's the day of wine. And Tisha B'Av is the day of wine because wine symbolizes the world. We could use it as a wonderful tool to appreciate what we have here, to connect to our Creator. And then actually Tisha B'Av could be a Yom Tov, as it was in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. Or if we misuse this world, we misuse the wine, we bring about destruction. So I feel comfortable labeling this beverage the most significant beverage given to us humans. The first time it appears in the Torah, it relates to a failure. The failure of Noach comes out of the Teva. I think I would also go for some wine, but he was criticized for it. It is interesting to note that there's something known as the Noah hypothesis, that scientists broke down the DNA of grapes from all regions of the world, and they traced their origins to Turkey, to an area near Mount Ararat, where Noah came out of the Teva. Interesting. But what relates to us as Jews is, of course, the halachic system. Now, this is the halachic history of this beverage. And the halachos we're going to focus on relate to the reality that we are not the only culture that appreciates this beverage, that should not be drinking in general out of a foam cup. Lechatchila, right? But Makom Tzorach, they're Makilim. Other cultures, other religions, they do exist. They appreciate the value of this beverage. And therefore, they want to use it to satisfy the forces that they worship, the gods they believed in. And it was extremely common in the world 3,000 years ago to offer wines in a pagan service. If you take the Rambam's approach to the Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam's approach that actually we perform services that were done in pagan environments, but we do it with the right intention. So you see that there's obviously a relationship. Other pagan cultures have libations, we do too, but we do it because it's a mitzvah. Due to the fact that this significant beverage was used to satisfy and to relate to these pagan destructive forces and gods, the rabbis had a great concern that if a non-Jew produces wine, or if the pagan even touches my wine, the rabbis were concerned that he might have some kind of intention to satisfy the forces in heaven and use it as a tool for avodah zarah, that which the Torah warns us to distance ourselves. Good evening. Come in. Join us. Good evening. Good to see you. Good evening. Welcome. Extremely concerned were our rabbis in the pagan world that they lived in, that perhaps the intention of my pagan neighbor when he touches my bottle, when he touches my wine, when he shakes the glass, is perhaps he is doing it for the sake of his God, and therefore, technically speaking, my wine, the wine, was used in some form of idolatry, avodah zarah. So the rabbis tell us that you should know, in your pagan environment, due to the fact that you have a pagan neighbor, and remember, paganism is not just wrong, it was destructive. These were people, as the Torah warns us, and as we know from history, they would want and they would be willing to satisfy their gods by even offering their children. It's not just wrong, it's corrupt. So therefore, we must distance ourselves from the pagans, And the rabbis tell us that if the wine is touched by the pagan, if the wine, of course, was produced by the pagan, it is something that we must not drink, and we must not even derive benefit from it. You cannot even derive benefit from it. That's what the rabbis tell us. Okay? Now, the rabbis took it one step further. They take it one step further. And as we know, socially, there is nothing better than bringing people together than a good glass or bottle of wine, right? How do you get people out? You have a wine tasting. We know that. That's a reality. And our tradition and our faith has a desire to preserve the people of Israel. And there's always that delicate balance that we have to be sensitive to humanity and sensitive to others, but at the same time, preserve our identity. Be sure there is a future to the people of Israel. And therefore, there are many, many statements that the rabbis make that we have to be careful as we interact with those nations, as we interact with them, not to lose our identity, and which might bring about intermarriage. So the rabbis made a decree, and listen to this. They made a decree that even if you are not living among pagans, even if your neighbor is not actually worshiping some pagan force, but rather they are just not Jewish, so the rabbis and the Talmud tell us, these are statements from 1800 years ago, that you should know that even in such a situation, there is a prohibition of drinking the wine produced by the non-Jew, deriving benefit from such a wine, and even if you have wine, but it was touched by the non-Jewish neighbor, the prohibitions apply. So they took over the stringencies that relate to Avodah Zarah, to paganism, and they transfer them to wine touched by a non-Jew. This is something that's mentioned by the Talmud. Fine. So we take it into consideration. Now, due to the fact that this decree, this very broad decree, originates in Avodah Zarah, in the issue that relates to idolatry and paganism, so therefore, if theoretically you would have a bottle of wine which cannot be used in a pagan temple due to the fact that it's inferior, so the second decree of prohibiting all wine touched by the non-Jew would not apply as well. So therefore we have a rule that if you have wine that has been cooked, which at that time, and perhaps you could present to us later on that today as well, it is inferior, and therefore it would never be used in a pagan environment, in a pagan temple. So therefore the second decree would not apply to it as well. And therefore nowadays, it is so common for us that if we are picking up wines, and we do have that awareness, we ask for the yain that is cooked, that is mevushal. Fine. That's what we have, and that's what we have been working with. And this was the norm, by the way, that if I would visit our ancestors in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century, their attitude was that if wine was produced by my not Jewish neighbor, I might respect them very much and have a very good relationship with them, but nevertheless, such wine would not be consumed, and I would not even derive benefit from such a wine. That's what the rabbis would tell us, based on a Talmudic statement. Things began to change in the 11th and 12th century in France. We do have French wine here tonight, right? So later on, and we're going to have a journey. We're going to travel from France to Italy, and then back home to the land of Israel. That's our journey tonight. What happened in France? Well, there were great rabbis there. And there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, known as Rashi. And he lived in a wine region. So therefore, the Jewish community he interacted with were, of course, in the wine industry, wine producers. The norm was at that time that come the holiday of Sukkot, what was the Chol HaMoed, intermediate days? What was the activity during that period of time? You would not be taking your kids to what's the name? Canadian Wonderland. Canada Wonderland was not the destination, and neither was the Legoland, but rather your destination would be out to the vineyard where you're going to be crushing your grapes. That's what you do in the fall in Champagne region in France. That was the norm. Now, what happened is that there was a few issues the rabbis had to deal with. And one of them was that quite often Jews were in the lending industry. And they would lend funds out to different parties. And when it came time to collect the funds, and the individuals did not have the ability of repaying, they would seek out valuable property belonging to the other party. Quite often, where wine is produced, the only item of value that can be collected to go ahead and collect your debt would be barrels of wine. And to go ahead and claim and argue that we have a tradition that there is a prohibition of deriving benefit from wine would make it impossible for many Jews to survive financially. So the rabbis did their research and they reassessed the situation, and they noted that perhaps the rabbinic decree established many centuries ago only related to a world where there were pagans. But in the world we live in the 11th century, where we no longer interact with pagans and paganism, so yes, the decree of drinking and consuming the non-kosher wine, meaning the wine touched or produced by the non-Jew, that remains intact, they note. It remains intact. However, the prohibition of deriving benefit, which the rabbis label hana'ah, that no longer applies. This is a statement that was made. They had a tradition regarding it. A lot is discussed, but this became practical Judaism. Practical Judaism, that in that school, in the French region, others were not as comfortable. But in that region, collecting barrels of wine to recover debt became the norm. Fine? That's what we had at that time. Now, it's interesting to note that there is a discussion in the Talmud. There's a discussion in the Talmud about what happens if a pagan baby, a pagan toddler, touches some wine. Okay, a discussion in the Talmud. So the rabbis have a dispute in the Talmud. One of the opinions is a rabbi called Shmuel. And Rabbi Shmuel in the Talmud, who lived in the beginning of the 3rd century, he was of the opinion that a pagan baby touching the bottle of wine, or touching the wine itself, would create absolutely no problem, because the only concern is intention. Babies have no such intention. That was the statement of Shmuel. Now at that time, in one of the institutions, in one of the rabbinic institutions in the 12th century, there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Milevsky, and he's sitting and he's studying with his students this topic, and he notes, Rabbi Milevsky says that, to me, it seems that Shmuel's opinion is correct. That if the baby, touches the wine, there's no problem with it, you could even drink it. Now, at the same time that statement was made, there were other statements circulating in the name of this Rabbeinu Tam's grandfather, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchak, known to us as Rashi. And the way Rashi's statement was presented and transmitted was as follows, that you should know. Nowadays, the pagans or the non-Jews are not pagans, but they are like a child. They are like toddlers regarding Avodah Zarah. They do not have an understanding of idolatry. That was a statement. As a result, if you combine these two statements, and number one, you go ahead and label the non-Jews regarding Avodah Zarah as toddlers, as babies, and at the same time follow the opinion of Shmuel, who notes that if a pagan baby touches wine, it does not prohibit it at all, and you could even drink it. If you take those two statements together, you know what happens? You could basically declare that nowadays, in the 12th century, it is permissible to even drink wine produced by a non-Jew. So there was a little bit of a panic. So a nephew of Rabbeinu Tam, a great rabbi, Yitzchak from Dampierre, writes him a letter and says to him, did you really say that? Because if indeed you said that, if I take your statement and your grandfather's statement and I combine them together, you are just basically deconstructing our whole tradition regarding the prohibition of wine. So Rabbi Natan backed off immediately, realizing that, yes, if you do the math, we have a problem. And he changed his mind and said, you know what, we don't follow Shmuel, or I never even said it. He had to back off from that statement. There was a level of tension, which always represents the idea that when you have a tradition, and you have to adjust it to a new reality, right, based on the system and within the system, there is always a concern that, what's the next boundary? There's that slippery slope. It was a concern that they dealt with, and I think they plugged the hole. But following that period of time, following that, there was an understanding that there are rabbis that allow you to derive benefit from wine produced by a non-Jew. Now, let's move forward to Italy. Welcome to Venice. Venice, the center of the world, you could say, in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. You are meeting people from east and west. You have communities there from Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and yes, they had their good fights. We have lots of literature about that as well, thank God. But the printing press is, in the first half of the 16th century, is growing there. People, it's a liberal city, and as a result, they want information. And if you were an halachic authority in the first half of the 16th century, and you wanted to publish your works, you start packing and find your next boat to Venice. Okay. Among those halachic authorities, who happened to be the halachic authority of that region, was a Rabbi Meir from Padua. Padua, a suburb of Venice, about 20 kilometers away. It was under the same authority regarding rabbinic issues. There was a Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen. Try that? Katzenellenbogen. Now, by the way, it might be a challenge to pronounce it, but I think it's one of the greatest last names if you're a rabbi. Meaning, if I would have to change my name, I would go to Katzenellenbogen, because for centuries, if you were a somebody, like the modern day Soloveitchik, right? That means for centuries, if you were a Katzenellenbogen, you were a well-respected rabbi. And we find them already in 15th century through the 18th century. Yechetzkel Katzenellenbogen, many, many great Rabbi Katzenellenbogens. Padua, Venice. Padua, Venice, from the 1530s. All the way to the end of the 16th century until 1597, it was Katzenellenbogen land. They were the halachic authorities. The father was Rabbi Meir, great halachic authority. The son, who perhaps was even more respected, had dozens of great scholars who were his talmidim, his disciples, were Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen. Remember the name. Shmuel Yehuda, they called him Maharshik. Morenu Harab Reb Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen. Great rabbinic authority. One of his disciples notes that while his master was alive, he hired an expert painter, an expert a person to make a portrait of him, artist to make a portrait of him. And he says that now I hang the portrait of my master in the library, writes this disciple Rav Avtalion. And when I study Torah, I see his image and I feel there's an angel in front of me. Now I want to get a hold of that portrait. Imagine the value. In other words, it would be fascinating. And who knows, if you ever visit the city of Revigo, perhaps you could locate the portrait and just bring it back to our shul. But for the time being, you just understand the significance of the Katzenellenbogens. In 1553, Venice, Rabbi Meir of Padua, Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen, publishes his tshuvot, his responsa. This is a copy of that edition, of the 1553 edition of his She'elot v'Tshuvot. This is a typical front page of a Venetian sefer, reprinted, of course, in the 20th century. And in it, he shares with us a story and an issue that is. Okay, and this is significant, extremely significant in our tradition. It worked as follows. There was an area under the auspices of Venice, not halachic, but politically, an area that they called Candia, known to us as the island of Crete. the island of Crete, which belongs today to Greece. In the island of Crete, they were producing sweet wines that were very popular. Okay? There was a father who lived in Venice, and his son was in Crete. The son, what he would do is he would purchase wine locally in Crete, non-kosher wine, meaning produced by a non-Jew, put it on a ship, get it to Venice, and the father would turn around and sell it locally. That was done. Okay? It was a successful venture, and eventually the father, who was in Venice, signed a long-term contract to be a supplier of such wines. And these are Torah Jews, people that are committed to our tradition, and their industry, the way this family survived was by purchasing the non-kosher, the wine produced by the non-Jews, and turning around and selling it. One day, the rabbis in Crete, there were rabbis there, so there was a Rabbi Eliyahu Kapsali. The rabbis of Crete meet this fellow, and they say to him, "What do you do for a living?" And he says, "Oh, I purchase local sweet wine, and I ship it to Venice." They say, "What? You make a living? You are deriving benefit from wine that is not kosher? It is against a statement in the Talmud. How can you do so?" So this was a very serious issue, and they decide to write to the Halachic authority. This is around probably in the late 1540s. They write to the Halachic authority who was in charge of Venice and the region, Rabbi Meir Kassan-Ellenbogen, and they ask him, "What do we do?" And the real question is, people in Venice were aware of it. He would turn around and sell it in Venice. Other Jews were involved as well. Nothing was claimed. Nothing was argued. No one complained. No halachic authority had an issue with him doing it in Venice. In Crete, they were concerned you're not allowed to derive benefit. So Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen addresses the issue. And he tells us that you should know, don't be so surprised that here in Venice, no one made a to-do about it, because here, the reality is, ba'avonotenu harabim, due to our great sins, en biadenu limchot begalil zeh, that we rabbis have no ability to stop people from their leniencies in this region, and that in this region, ruba deruba is terminology of the majority of the majority, a very high percentage of good Jews committed to our faith and to our Torah, konim me'arelim bashuk, they purchase wine from the non-Jews, veshotim otam, and they drink it. Meaning, here we are introduced to some new behavior that we are not familiar with, that is very foreign to us, that suddenly we identify a leniency not just to derive benefit from the wine produced by the non-Jew, but even to drink it. Now, this is not sanctioned by the rabbis, but many people do it, he notes. So, as a result, he is an halachic authority. He would not allow such a thing, Rabbi Meir. But what he notes is that since people are lenient, and in addition, we have the tradition from France from the 12th century that nowadays you're allowed to derive benefit. So therefore, post facto, since they already signed the contract, so therefore you have to go ahead and respect it. And in this situation, I allow you to continue the purchasing of non-kosher wine and selling it. A leniency that's given. Now this statement, this tshuva of the Maharam, becomes part of a halachic system. So technically speaking, someone asks me, I'm at a duty-free, and I see this bottle of wine that's not kosher, that I know very well that I could purchase it here for $35 and turn around and sell it at home for $200. Can I do it? I would say that technically speaking, due to the halachic system, we do not go ahead and purchase it, because we try to avoid deriving benefit from it. However, post facto, if someone gave me during the holiday season a nice bottle of wine that is not kosher, and therefore I did not go ahead and actively seek it, but I received it, so then it would be 100% permissible to return to the LCBO and ask them to exchange it for a good bourbon or rye for others, right? That would be permissible. Now, that's what we have. Now, this tshuva, this responsa, its significance is due to the fact that it becomes codified. Meaning, who codified for us Ashkenazi Jews, for us here who are Ashkenazim? Who codified law for us? We turn to Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Ramah. The Ramah lives in Poland from around 1520 to 1572. He codifies Jewish law for us, and he writes that you should know today you could be lenient. You could be lenient in situations of loss. For example, if the only way you could recover monies and funds is by collecting barrels of non-kosher wine, it is permissible. He hands us this leniency, and his source is this tshuva, this responsa from Maharam of Padua, Rabbi Meir, Katzenel, and Bogan, of extremely significant tshuva. However, we have a little bit of a problem here, because here you have a very high percentage of people behaving in a way that the rabbis in general do not approve of, drinking non-kosher wine. So the question is, how did the rabbis relate to it? What did they do about it? So, as you can imagine, there are many, many letters written by rabbis of the second half of the 16th century, being extremely critical of those communities where people are lenient and even drink non-kosher wine. And it became a massive issue, where you had rabbis traveling from community to community, presenting to them the new crisis, and the rabbis would write letters. Among them was the Maharal from Prague, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Rabbi Elia Kapsali. It became the norm of writing letters and complaining about the fact that there is great leniencies that exist in the world. One rabbi had a little bit of a different attitude towards this problem. One rabbi was very much aware of the leniencies that existed, and that was Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Ramah. But he wrote a response of 124, extremely significant to keep in mind that number. In response to 124, he addresses it, but he has a very different tone. His tone is, listen here, you ask me, in other words, I am addressing the issue that there is a minhag b'medinat Merin, that in Merin and Moravia, there's this leniency. And in other places as well, there is a leniency that many go ahead and drink non-kosher wines. So, you want to know, you're asking me, if do they have what to rely on? And he writes one of the most magnificent shuvos, where he says, I might not disagree, might not agree with them. They're perhaps not following what I recommend, but at the same time, if so many people are doing something, I have a responsibility to go ahead and try to explain it within the system, to try to defend it, not to label them as chashudim, not to label them as people that are not trustworthy. And he goes ahead and he puts effort and energy into defending a position which on the surface is against the halachic system, but he felt a responsibility, because if Jews do it, if others do it, it becomes my business to try to be melamed zchus, to try to find a merit in their behavior. This is a magnificent tshuva that we find. Fine? Tshuva 124. What's interesting is that if you would take a Ramah, Tshuvas, the response of the Ramah, and you would want to look up this response 124 to see and analyze, because it is indeed magnificent, and you would pull out in the library the Amsterdam edition from 1711. The response 124 is actually what is in this book 125. In other words, the printers in Amsterdam in the beginning of the 18th century were either encouraged or made their own decision to yank out that responsa. They felt that it's not appropriate. And they moved it out, and therefore it is no longer there. And it's quite fascinating, because in this tshuva, the Ramah notes that you should know that that there are reasons to be lenient. For example, he notes that if a person is ill, even if it's not a life-threatening situation, but he's ill, and the doctor says that it will assist him in his recovery to have non-kosher wine, so therefore, in such a situation, you could be lenient. This is a blanket statement he makes, that in such a situation you could be lenient, an incredible statement. And now, after 1711, if you would turn to some rabbi and ask him, does such a tshuva really exist? Well, some rabbis would say, I'm not sure, because I look at some editions of the Ramah, and it is printed. Other editions of the Ramah, and it is not printed. There was confusion that existed. And I have here works of the Chaya Adam, an early 19th century authority, who writes that we don't know if we could even rely on it because it's not in all the editions. A very fascinating story that occurred regarding this tshuva. But what I'm going to focus on, where was the main issue? Where was this main problem of people being lenient with the wine? What was the city? What was the location? Padua and its environment, and Venice. Correct. Padua and Venice indeed. In this tshuva, he notes that you should know that I've heard of the problem that exists in Moravia. That in Moravia and other places, that people are lenient. He read this tshuva of Rabbi Meir from Padua regarding Venice, that there's a problem in Venice. He knew that the issue was really in Venice, but he doesn't want to mention Venice for some reason. And what's very, very interesting is that there was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Shapira who put out a pamphlet where he warns, and he collected all the letters of all the rabbis who were extremely critical of communities that are lenient, but he wouldn't print it in Venice. In other words, there was some kind of cover-up in Venice that they didn't want to talk about the issue. And when you look at the rabbis that existed during that period of time, the second half of the 16th century, from 1550 to the year 1600, if you look through the literature, you realize that none of the rabbis who are complaining and making a to-do about what is happening in that community, none of them are from Venice, meaning the issue is in Venice. Some rabbis don't want to mention Venice, and in Venice itself they don't even address it. There's a little bit of a confusion that does exist, and it's a mystery. But actually, sometimes you find clarity from different sources. And what do I mean by that? Among the great controversies in our wonderful tradition is a controversy that occurred between the year 1600 and 1608 in Revigo, in Italy, regarding a mikvah. What was the issue? The mikvah plays so much part of our tradition. All communities always had one. There was a unique mikvah in Revigo where they had a natural water source, some kind of spring, and the way they transferred water from the spring to the pit was through some kind of water aqueduct, but they would use pails to lift the water. The pail was constructed in a way that it had a knoll. It was a very technical mikvah. But in the year 1600, a massive controversy erupted in Revigo, where some rabbis felt it was okay, others not. And it became a big fight. And remember, you're near Venice, so if you have a fight, you could publish it. So therefore, I'm sure there were many other issues that existed in the world, but due to the fact that they were right next to Venice and there were so many rabbis that had opinions, they printed them. So therefore, you could go to the HebrewBooks.org and read through in detail of these incredible issues that existed during that period of time in the first few years of the 17th century regarding the mikveh in Revigo. Fine, fascinating topic. The rabbis in that generation, all the rabbis in that region in northern Italy, were all disciples of Maharshik, Moreno, Arab Reb, Shmuel, Yehuda, Katzenellenbogen. All of them are disciples. So therefore, the rabbi of Revigo, Rab Avtalion Mekonsili, Rab Avtalion was his first name, beautiful first name, Mekonsili. So Rab Avtalion was actually one of the great disciples, and he believed the mikvah is not kosher. He was very, very strict. Among the rabbis, one of the local rabbis who disagreed with him was a Rabbi Yekusiel Mikonsili, his brother. And it was a family feud that brought in all the rabbis in Italy. That was the big to do, the mikveh of Revigo. You could speak to any anyone that's have studied Jewish history, he'll tell you, oh, the Mikveh Revigo, incredible topic because there's so much that was recorded. And the text got a little bit personal, unfortunately. Until someone recorded that you should know Reb Avtalion, Mekonsil, Reb Avtalion, you are such a big machmir with mayim, you have these great stringencies that relate to water, but you are a mekel beyain, but you have leniencies when it comes to wine. There was some kind of dig there. In other words, Reb Avtalion had a reputation that he was among the Meruba Deruba, the majority of Jews in that region, who was lenient, who would drink wine that wasn't produced kosher. So he had to defend himself. You attack a rabbi in such a way. And he defends himself, and it actually makes its appearance at the editor of this latest edition of Maram Padua. He notes at the end of it that you should know Maram Padua was strict. In other words, the leniency that Maram Padua gave, Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen gave, was only regarding deriving benefit. We find Reb Avtalion being lenient with drinking, correct? But listen to this. Reb Avtalion has to defend himself from these accusations, and he says, I'll be honest with you, I actually do drink wine that is not produced kosher. This is shocking. However, I have a tradition from my master, my teacher, Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen, was lenient. And he was of the opinion that, yes, there is a rabbinic decree not to drink it in an environment where you could go ahead and relate and perhaps could affect the future of the people of Israel. But at home, noted Maharshik, I don't think there's a problem. Now, this was an earthquake, a real earthquake in rabbinic history, one that we tried to cover up as much as possible. And therefore, it made such a to-do that by 1608, he had to retract his statement. And it's printed in it's like one of those, today when they print books, there's an awareness that you're going to print only that which is relevant in Sfarim. In the Shulchan Aruchs that were printed in Vilna, they had some extra room there, and they printed letters from the 17th century Italy. And in it, they write, it's in fine print, I think most people overlook it. And he notes that you should know, and this is a letter that's going to be signed by Rav Avtalion, and he says, B'Shem Hashem, in the name of God, that you should know that the small publication that came out in my name, that you could be lenient with such wine, I back off. Hineni mevatel oto. I'm canceling my statement. And you should know that al yisha'en shum adam alav b'hatir. No one should be lenient. He's not saying I don't drink. What is he saying? No one should rely on it. It became a massive issue to go ahead and declare that the Gadol Hador, the greatest authority in Italy at the second half of the 16th century, is among the rabbis was impossible. Now, we do get a little bit of clarity that suddenly, when Ramosha Isserlis is running a tshuva about those who are lenient with wine, like in Moravia, they don't want to mention Venice. And the reason you don't find the rabbis in Venice addressing it is because they actually, the head of the Beit Din until 1597, was among those who are lenient. Now, by the way, it gives me some clarity. I remember I was once reading up about the great French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who was a committed Torah Jew. So they note, his biographer notes that he was careful with all areas of Jewish law. He was only lenient with non-kosher wine that he would drink, which sounds far, but there were traditions. Now let me just make myself clear that in this day and age, as the Ramah notes, the Ramah himself, who tries to defend such practice, he writes that if someone in this day and age, in a community where there is an awareness, tries to ignore it, he is a poretz geder ve'yinshacheno nachash. In other words, it is like breaking a fence or going to, they have a reptile museum up in Vaughan. It's like going there and breaking the glass and sitting there and allowing the snakes to eat you up. In other words, it is something that is prohibited. We have to have the ability and the maturity to go ahead and sense that, you know what, perhaps for us, but there were those, and the Ramah has that greatness that he could defend that which today we absolutely cannot, within the system, cannot do. But it's a fascinating piece of history that gives us some clarity. There was a rabbi called Rabbi Shapsi Be'er, in the beginning, during that period of time, and he notes, and it even appears in the Shulchan Aruch, it appears that he was of the opinion that if come Friday night, and you look at it, and you don't have any wine, and the only wine available is not kosher, so he notes that you could be lenient. It is like unbelievable because the mitzvah of making Kiddush on wine predates the rabbinic decree of drinking non-kosher wine. Now these are statements that we don't know how to read nowadays. In other words, the immature mind cannot even absorb that there was a different world, there was a different attitude. But that was the reality that existed. Italian rabbis in general were very, very fascinating. Rabbis of the Renaissance. Rabbi Shmuel Yehuda Katzenellenbogen had a disciple called Rabbi Leon de Modena. Now Rabbi Leon de Modena in his autobiography writes that he had a gambling problem. A very, very unique, a gambling problem. You don't find today, at least you don't know about it, about rabbis that have such problems. It's very, very interesting, but he publicized it, and it was a very, very different world. Venice is a different place. It is a liberal city, and therefore this reality existed, and the rabbis had a sensitivity of somehow trying and failing to cover up the true story and the true events that occurred then. We, indeed, today are on Tu B'Shvat, and Tu B'Shvat is a day when we celebrate and we reconnect to our homeland, to the land of Israel. And therefore, I am a big believer that if you have the ability of purchasing wine from Israel, it should be the first wine you choose, not just to support the economy, but to strengthen our link to the land of Israel. I'm going to have the privilege tomorrow afternoon to, God willing, fly to the land of Israel. I'm going to be, you joining?
I'll be there.
You'll be there. When are you leaving?
After Shabbos on Saturday.
Okay, I can assume you are. So we'll see you, God willing, there. And we'll re-strengthen the relationship we have, especially with this government, to our homeland. So it's an opportunity for us to show our appreciation to the Almighty and to those who support our country. And we should keep in mind the history of France, Italy, and always remember our homeland, Eretz Yisrael. Thank you. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Great questions. Anyone want to add anything? Want to welcome our member of Parliament, Mark Adler.
Thank you.
And take care of him.
I won't let him out of my sight. When he said gambling problem with a rabbi, can they keep it under wraps now? I'll keep a close eye.
So I'd like to give you your attention to Miriam, who's going to talk about some of the slur we have on the table.
I thought you were going to speak about the bushel.
You could. There's a lot could be added, but.
Okay, well, what I'll do is, I know everybody's waiting to taste some wine, so I'll give you first, this is Collage. It's made by Tepperberg Winery in Israel. It's a blended wine. It's Cabernet Sauvignon and Petit Syrah grapes blended together. It's Mevushal. Okay, and I'll explain. Mevushal, it has been boiled, but the process that we use nowadays is not like you boil it for an hour or two and kill every taste that's in there. It's similar to, it's pasteurized, and the process that's used is a high temperature, short times. So it brings it to boiling and then rapidly cools it off, so that you're not really killing the wine. There are some Mevushal wines that are quite excellent. Okay, this one happens to be a very good one. Okay, and it's Israeli. Okay.
I'm going to take them around while you introduce them.
Okay.